Our second speaker today is Merlo Kelly, who's a practicing architect and also teaches as a design tutor and occasional lecturer in the School of Architecture at UCD. In 2011, she completed a Master's in Urban and Building Conservation in UCD, and her study on the Luke Gardner and the Gardner Estate, Conserving an Urban Morphology. She was awarded the ICOMOS Rachel McRory Memorial Award for this thesis, which really is very relevant as it covered a study of today's North Inner City, Dublin, against the backdrop of the Gardner's late 18th century urban developments. She's also been involved in projects of survey of 20th century architecture and also contributors to the inventory of Dublin City commissioned by the NIAH. So I ask Merlo now to come up.
The legacy of the visionary 18th century developers and craftsmen in the form of our contemporary urban framework has long been celebrated. The Gardner Estate accounted for much of our North City and is illustrated in this map of estates by Adele Sheridan, where I've highlighted it in red. The estate underwent considerable expansion and change in the last quarter of the 18th century. Luke Gardner, in his work as a private developer and as a wide streets commissioner, was responsible for much of this urban transformation. Laid across medieval street forms and geometries, the streetscape set out by Gardner and the Wide Streets Commission provides the urban framework for our North City today. My studies attempted to unpick the narrative of the North Georgian core with a view to gaining a greater understanding of this urban morphology and a new reading of our North Inner City. There were in fact two Luke Gardners, grandfather and grandson, and I focused on the work of the second Luke Gardner, Baron and subsequently Viscount Mountjoy, henceforth referred to as Gardner. He was born in 1745. I'll just give you an image of him here. And died in the Battle of New Ross in 1798. He was a developer, a wide streets commissioner, a member of Parliament, and a campaigner for Catholic rights. His grandfather, the first Luke Gardner, began life as a footman in Leixlip Castle. He became a successful banker and acquired and developed tracts of land north of the Liffey in the early 18th century. He married into the Stewart family, connecting himself to the peerage, and became a member of Parliament. Unlike his grandfather, who came from a humble background, Gardner enjoyed a privileged upbringing, being educated at Eton and St. John's College, Cambridge. He travelled widely in Europe and was reputed to have a fine appreciation of art and architecture. Gardner took up the mantle of his grandfather, expanding and developing the family estate. Perhaps more interestingly, though, Gardner seemed intent on connecting the various set pieces within the estate and making sense of the loose, fragmented quality that was associated with the North Georgian city. A quote from Nuala Burke's PhD thesis entitled Dublin 1600 to 1800. Luke Gardner, the most active of the commissioners, was also the most active and original private developer of his day. An examination of Roke's 1756 map of Dublin illustrates the medieval street pattern radiating from the historic core of the city. So just to orientate you, this is the Liffey running along here, and we have the Sackville Mall here, and we're here. So the juxtaposition of this imposed streetscape with the embedded urban grain becomes evident in late 18th century and early 19th century maps and is illustrated in the Wilson's 1806 directory map. So there's the medieval streets radiating. A new geometry is established, cranked across the radial streets and connecting the various set pieces within the Gardner estate. Despite Gardner's interventions into the existing streetscape, the geometry radiating from the medieval core endures, resulting in a sequence of oblique and unexpected visual connections and allowing a series of vistas to unfold. And the medieval roads are shown dotted here in an abstraction of the urban composition. So you can see the Customs House here, Gardner Street up to Mountjoy Square. This is the Royal Circus that I was referring to, and Parnell Square here. The proposal for the Royal Circus, located on the highest ground of the Gardner estate, some 80 feet over sea level, on the current site of the Mater Hospital, was without a doubt Gardner's most ambitious urban scheme. The elliptical housing plan was designed to connect the various strands of the Gardner estate, forming a cohesive whole and creating a focal point for the North Georgian city. 3 primary strands were to emanate from the circus, providing coherency in an estate that had expanded in a somewhat irregular fashion. In 1792, the plans for the Royal Circus were approved by the Wide Streets Commission. The scheme was no doubt influenced by the work of John Wood the Elder and Younger, who designed the Royal Circus and the Royal Crescent in Bath. And Frederick O'Dwyer observes how, unlike Bath, the Crescent at Hardwicke Place never got its companion, the Royal Circus, proposed by Francis Johnson for the far end of Eccles Street. So here we have St. George's Church in Hardwicke Place and the proposed Royal Circus here. And an image of the Royal Circus in Bath by Grimm, dated 1773. The design of the Royal Circus, though set out and surveyed by Thomas Sherard, is commonly attributed to Francis Johnson, who was the architect for St. George's Church in Hardwicke Place and a resident of Eccles Street. This is the only surviving drawing of Gardner's proposed circus. It's signed T. Cunningham, and there is speculation that the author of the drawing is Thomas Cunningham, a draftsman who worked for Johnston. Though the Royal Circus never materialised, it featured on directory maps over a period of nearly 40 years, and its siting forms a sequence in a series of urban design moves that were critical in the formation of Dublin City. A comprehensive approach to city expansion and urban spatial design emerges in the work of the Wide Streets Commission, of which Gardner was a pivotal member from 1778 until his death in 1798. With the exception of the Lord Mayor, all the commissioners were members of Parliament. This gave them considerable power in effecting change. However, Edward MacFarland observes that the commissioners possessed additional skills. Power alone could not have achieved what the commissioners achieved in the late 18th century had this power not been accompanied by the discrimination and taste of these men. By 1790, the remit of the Wide Streets Commission was extended to control new developments in private estates. From this date, any new streets laid out in private estates required approval from the Commission. And we see the shaded area denoting the Gardner estate up here in the northeast of the city, where much development was carried out in the 1790s. There's little doubt that Gardner's role as a Wide Streets Commissioner helped his position as a private developer, but this was true of many of the commissioners, including Gardner's brother-in-law Beresford. Christine Casey observes that their aesthetic ambitions were fueled by private concerns. Thomas Sherard, the city surveyor and surveyor to the Wide Streets Commission, also acted as surveyor in a private capacity for Gardner. Leases for properties in the Gardner estate in the 1780s and 1790s were accompanied by Sherard's precise coloured maps with detailed dimensions and notes. This overlap in Sherard's duties was another in a series of happy coincidences for Gardner in his responsibilities as a commissioner, member of Parliament and private developer. The Wide Streets Commission minute books allow a fascinating insight into the Commission's proceedings, providing an essential context for Gardner's operations in expanding and developing the estate. Their meetings were generally held in the Royal Exchange, but were occasionally held in Gardner's family home at 10 Henrietta Street. There are several instances recorded in the Wide Streets Commission minutes where Gardner promotes the benefit to the public of interventions that are clearly in his personal interest. Rutland Street is a case in point. Lower Rutland Street was established on the directory maps in 1792, a lengthy street extending between Summerhill and Montgomery Street. So it's this street here, and this is Mountjoy Square up here. In an excerpt from the minutes, Gardner informs the commissioners of advantages to the public of an approach from Summerhill to Mountjoy Square. Lord Mountjoy stated to the board that it would be of great convenience to the public that an approach should be made to Mountjoy Square from Summerhill, opposite to Rutland Street, and therefore moved that there should be an order of the board to value the grounds and houses between Great Charles Street and Summerhill to enable him to open a street to the width of 60 feet. Not only do the commissioners agree to carry out such a valuation, but they also agree to cover the costs of the exercise. ordered that a jury be impanelled to value said concerns, and this board agrees to defray the expense of said valuation, as it appears it will be of great public utility. In the 1793 directory maps, Rutland Street Upper appears, forming the desired connection between Summerhill and Mountjoy Square via Great Charles Street. So this is the street that emerges here, it's Charles Street here. The erratic expansion of the Gardner estate in staged land acquisitions renders the exact boundary lines of the estate difficult to define. To confuse matters further, Gardner's building schemes often stretched beyond the limits of his own property. An undated map of Cavendish Row in North Great George's Street from the National Archive, shown here, illustrates lands belonging to Sackville Gardner, Luke Gardner's uncle. A portion outlined in red marks the lands of the Archdale estate. A closer inspection shows pieces of land to be exchanged, required to complete the intended streetscape. Lands to give and take are clearly indicated, flanking sides of a proposed roadway. So we have here take and give and take here to make the formal road. The choice of words and clarity of sentiment is quite telling. And if we overlay this map on the 1847 OS map, we can see how the recognisable street forms begin to emerge. Though relating to Sackville Gardner's land, this method of exchange may give clues as to how Gardner achieved his regular block boundaries. Gardner had clauses written into his lease agreements, ensuring that he maintained control when forming his urban blocks and associated streets. A map of Mr. John Seaton's holding in Temple Street, set out by Thomas Sheridan in 1779, depicts Seaton's plot shaded in pink. The plot effectively terminates Denmark Street, but a tentative intervention through the plot of land has been added to the drawing and the boundary partially erased, allowing access to Gardner's Square beyond, which was to become Mountjoy Square. So this is the block here, and you can see there's kind of a little piece rubbed out to allow a passageway through. Again, overlaying this map on the 1847 OS map, we can see the origins of Gardner Place form within the block. This new street leading to the square, then called Gardner's Place, is consolidated in a 1789 map, this time leased to Crosby. And though it didn't materialise until the 1780s, Gardner was evidently planning Mountjoy Square as early as 1779. So you can see the passageway through from Denmark Street to Mountjoy Square. It was in Gardner's interest to retain this connection and facilitate the building of houses along Gardner Place, as it was a primary connection between two focal urban spaces in his estate. Rutland Square, now Parnell Square, where we are today, and Gardner's Square, now Mountjoy Square. So again, you can see this is the connection between the two squares emerging here. Extensive schemes carefully outlined in Gardner's lease maps often make reference to land beyond the remit of his control. Often these are small corners of an irregular site that would involve straightforward negotiation to complete a regular rectangular plot, as in the case of this lease. A note on the drawing reads, "The ground within the dotted line at A is not at present in the possession of Lord Mountjoy, but is to be given up to Mr. Warren and the stable lane opened so soon as his lordship obtains possession thereof." Another landowner's considerations were at stake in Gardner's scheme for Gloucester Street, now Sean McDermott Street, and Gloucester Place. Several of Sherrod's lease maps make reference to the Earl of Farnham, who owned much of the tract of land on which the Gloucester Diamond was to be built. A clear diagonal line on the lease maps east of the diamond illustrates the property boundary. So just to show you, this is the line, the boundary line of the property. So the Earl of Farnham owns this land here. Gardner's lease maps show the relevant plots highlighted in red, and the line of ownership divides actual house plots in certain cases, with Gardner relying on the participation of the Earl of Farnham, who was noted to be agreeable to the line marked on the map hereto annexed. It could be argued that Gardner's skill was in the manipulation of found geometries, street patterns, and land parcels. His development of Gloucester Street is an interesting illustration of this approach. Gloucester Street appears on Scallay's amended Roke map in 1773, terminating on Marlborough Street at St. Thomas's Church. So you can see the church is there, and that's the beginnings of Gloucester Street. Gardner extended the street eastward, issuing leases for Gloucester Street in Place in 1791. The Gloucester Diamond bisects the length of Gloucester Street, and the western vista is terminated by St. Thomas's Church. So this is set up here. We have the diamond here, and the street is extended eastwards and terminates in St. Thomas's Church there. While Gardner's interest in the creation of new streets and squares illustrates a consciousness of the larger urban gesture, his attention to detail with regard to individual plot and house suggests that he was equally engaged at both scales. Gardner drew up unusually detailed lease documents for each plot on his estate. He maintained control over design by inserting covenants into his lease agreements, outlining the quality and scale of the development required and time limits within which they were to be constructed. The leases for the Royal Circus included descriptions of the materials and ornamentation in considerable detail. In the absence of drawings, these leases provide a valuable insight into the construction of Gardner's domestic buildings, in theory at least. A degree of social engineering proved part of the plan, with several more antisocial trades being outlawed in his developments, such as those listed here. Despite influences from schemes in London, Bath and Edinburgh, Dublin's terraces retained an understated, stripped-down quality, particular to Irish Georgian dwellings. Gardner aspired to grandiose compositions in his designs for Mountjoy Square and the unrealised Royal Circus, but in reality the formal uniform frontages of Charlotte Square and Bedford Square did not translate to the Irish context. This may be partially due to the speculative building methods employed by developers such as Gardner, which involved the leasing of manageable groups of plots to builders and small-scale developers who were obliged to build within the parameters prescribed in his leases. Maurice Craig makes reference to the legacy of the 18th century speculative building methods in Dublin. This method led to the erection of houses in batches of 3 or 4, with no more than an approximate uniformity over a square or a street, which is the characteristic beauty of Dublin. This system of development negated schemes such as Gardner's ambitious design for Mountjoy Square, the west side of which is portrayed in this drawing by Thomas Sherrod, dated 1787. The scheme included a singular monumental facade with a central dome, flanked by projecting end pavilions, perhaps inspired by a number of contemporary projects in Britain at the time, among them Queen Square in Bath. Though Gardner's monumental proposals for the square were abandoned, Mountjoy Square remains a pivotal plan unit in the development of the 18th century city, connecting the proposed Royal Circus to the north, the Customs House to the south, and Rutland Square or Parnell Square to the west. Mountjoy Square tied together a number of disparate urban set pieces, yet was set out in such a way to provide a sense of enclosure for the central green space. When the Dublin-based Parliament was transferred to London following the Act of Union in 1800, there was no longer a market for grand city residences. Their scale rendered them suitable for multiple tenancy occupation, though their services were not adequate for such numbers. The deterioration in North Dublin's housing stock was swift. Lacking basic sanitary facilities and on occasion space and light, the houses rapidly fell into decline. This reality is borne out in the RSAI Darkest Dublin Archive photographic collection, dating from 1913, and in the 1918 Housing Committee Condition Survey, highlighted by Jacinta Prunty in her essay, The Townhouse as Tenement. The loss in fabric is dramatic when comparisons are drawn with other Georgian cities such as Edinburgh and Bath. Part of this could be attributed to the fact that the large-scale Georgian dwellings in Dublin's North City were typically built as single occupancy houses aimed at accommodating the aristocratic upper classes, whereas Edinburgh's housing stock contained purpose-built flats designed to cater for professional and merchant classes. The North City streetscapes has suffered considerably over the years. Mass demolition in the second half of the 20th century has left us with a series of urban voids and disjointed fragments. This is Mountjoy Square West, pictured here in the 1980s. And to finish up, the urban framework laid down by Gardner and his commissioners continues to dominate today's streetscape. However, undermined by disappearing built fabric and without the focus of the Royal Circus, the power of Gardner's 18th century vision is diluted. Gardner's Dublin was a landscape of roots, connected urban space and vistas, interwoven with the medieval road patterns. Though never consolidated, traces of these roots are still legible, straddling the historic streets which radiate from the medieval core. Despite considerable losses and gaps in the fabric of the North Inner City, a rich heritage remains with much to be preserved. The elevated position in the city, the carefully constructed terraces, and the resilient street forms of the North Georgian core reflect Gardner's ambitions to create a desirable place to live. An understanding and awareness of the remaining fabric and its evolution in the past is a prerequisite to securing a positive future. However, examining the North City today, a series of blockages and lost connections become evident. And I should stress that this is just a very initial study. Rutland Street Upper, which I mentioned earlier, was set up on axis with the Free Church in the late 18th century, forming an approach to Mountjoy Square from Summerhill, as Gardner intended. Today's Sean O'Casey Avenue forms an inward-looking enclave, disconnected from its surrounding streets. And we have an image of Rutland Street in 1952, and then an image of Sean O'Casey Avenue today. But I suppose more striking is the view from Summerhill, which was intended as the approach to the Free Church. And it's separated by 2 or 3 level changes and a series of barriers. And this is the junction with Summer Street North, which has been closed off. Again, that connection is lost. Bella Street off Rutland Street Lower is another case in point. Disconnected from neighbouring streets by locked gates and steps, it becomes a dead urban space. Mecklenburg Street off Rutland, Mecklenburg Street, now Railway Street, is depicted on Wilson's 1773 map here, extending to Marlborough Street. And then again on the 1847 OS map. So today's Railway Street is truncated by pastiche Georgian-style housing development on Gardner Street, eliminating the connection to Marlborough Street. So you can see Railway Street is terminated by this built where it would have continued on to Marlborough Street in the past. And that's just in the last couple of decades. The original St. Thomas's Church was destroyed by fire in the Civil War in 1922, and its replacement was built off axis to allow Gloucester Street to extend to O'Connell Street. As a consequence, the relationship between the church and the diamond was lost. Hicks Church, despite its considerable architectural merit, sits rather uncomfortably on its site, as though making way for the street to pass. So you can see this connection here is kind of lost, I suppose, by the movement of the church. Okay. And we have here the Gloucester Diamond, photographed in 1913, since demolished, and today's diamond, where only the footprint and the name survive. So just very quickly through a couple of, this is Eccles Street. Again, I'm not meaning to focus on the negative, but just to understand what was there. Eccles Street in 1950s, and then Eccles Street today with George's Church in the background. Middle Gardner Street in 1929, and Middle Gardner Street today. We have Summerhill here, recorded in the Darkest Dublin collection in 1913, and in the 1970s, the terraces there prior to demolition, and then an aerial view of today's streetscape along Summerhill. I just did an overlay of the 1847 OS map. You can see it very faintly there. Really just to try and get a sense of the original grain and scale of the street, which has qualities of a motorway today. So, to conclude, throughout the second half of the 20th century, there was much focus on large-scale, sprawling developments, which tended to ignore the grain, scale, and character of the North City core, and cost us much of our architectural heritage. This phenomenon has only been accentuated through the boom years. This current period of reflection should give us an opportunity to focus on the North Georgian core, to record and evaluate the historical fabric that survives, and to contemplate future steps. many positive developments emerging in recent years, such as the plan to develop Parnell Square as a cultural quarter, as seen in the top image here, with the Garden of Remembrance and the Hugh Lane. And several community projects such as the Summer Row Garden pictured here, and events such as this, which are critical in raising awareness. And a quote from Tim Robinson, "The nature of the fragment can reveal the pattern of the whole. It is often through examination of detail that we gain an understanding of the greater context. Unlike Edinburgh and Bath, where architects played a significant role in developing the streets and squares, construction in 18th century Dublin was typically developer-led and built by artisans and craftsmen. As a resident landlord in his estate, Gardner's hands-on approach with regard to the control of materials and proportions in building meant that his most detailed decisions were informed by his vision for the estate. Though Gardner and his contemporaries imposed rigid rules for building, a subtle richness of expression emerged within the architecture. Aside from the lavish interiors, the stamp of the individual found expression through the craft of building, creating this characteristic beauty referred to by Craig. While mindful of the greater urban context, Gardner and his contemporaries placed considerable focus on the craft of building and on the individual house, creating a rigorous urban grain. An awareness of this 18th century urban legacy should prompt a shift towards incremental and thoughtful urban development in the future and a greater sense of place in the North Georgian core. Thank you.